Welcome on to the next episode of the Fast Beyond 50 podcast. I am super excited to be jumping into today's topic because it's something we get asked a lot here at coachparry.com, and that is about VO2 max. And we are diving deep into VO2 max today, finding out exactly what it is and why it matters, particularly for runners over 50. And the big important question, which is probably the one we get asked all the time, is how do you improve your VO2 max? That's all coming up in today's podcast. My name is Brad Nadalt. We've got the Coach Lindsey Parry with us once again. Linz, are you well?
I am. Am pretty excited with Berlin just around the corner. So yeah, we're doing well, and we're looking forward to a good trip to the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah, we had the chat or the question about Strava and watching other people on Strava last week on the podcast, and I've been watching you on Strava to see how your training's been going, and it's looking pretty good. Are you feeling confident going into Berlin?
Yeah, so I am. It's been slightly disjointed in terms of preparation, but I was chatting to another client who's going with me, and it's kind of weird how we both had a kind of a similar-ish build-up in that we've been consistent, but haven't quite gotten to everything that we maybe planned. Um, but in my case, my let's call them key sessions have really all gone really well. After feeling like I battled for quite a long time, and I was just basically thinking like that I was behaving a bit like the cobbler's children, because I keep telling people, particularly people over 50, that they need to do a little bit less to achieve the same results. And I had some high school reunions in the build up to this one, kids' school holiday. We went away for a little trip here and there. And so I was beating myself up because I wasn't quite getting to all my training. But funny enough, those trips coincided with me starting to run better because I was running a little bit less. So actually, I was forced to eat my own medicine, and it's worked quite well. So yeah, let's see how we go. But I'm feeling a little more confident than I was at the end of August.
Quietly optimistic. That is great news. All right, let's dive into VO2 max. And before we get into the meat and potatoes, I think let's set the table, if you'd like. What is VO2 max?
So very simply, Brad, VO2 max is a literal measure of the amount of oxygen that you as an individual can use in a minute. Okay, so it's expressed in different ways. It's expressed as liters per minute, and now that's an absolute term. So that is literally, this is the number of liters of oxygen that your body is able to process in a minute. And then we express it as milliliters per kilogram of body mass per minute. And that is so that we can compare individuals, and I'm doing that for in italics for those that are listening, because in reality, we don't want to or need to compare across individuals. There is a very strong genetic link. It's not fixed. So I think this is also a myth we must dispel right at the beginning, is that your VO2 isn't your VO2 is your VO2. People used to think like, let's measure VO2 because it's such a good, shows such a good potential for performance. But what we've learned is that through the right type of training, you can absolutely change VO2 max. You can change it quite a lot. But then there is a strong link. So some people will only be able to improve it up to a point. So there is like a maximum number for some people. Some people will start with a slightly higher natural VO2 max. Obviously, it declines as we get older, which is part of what we are here to talk about. But I think that gives you a good basis for what is VO. When we talk about VO2 max, what are we talking about? I think that's I've given a simple and clear enough explanation for that.
Right. Before we talk about sort of how to measure it and how to improve it, I think, Lindsey, let's talk about why it matters and why VO2 max is important. And this is obviously a running podcast. We talk about running after the age of 50. So there is a performance aspect to it, which I wanted to touch on, and probably let's cover that first. And then we'll talk a little bit about the sort of health and longevity aspects of VO2 max. But let's talk specifically from a performance perspective. Why does VO2 max matter from a performance perspective?
So, for two reasons. The first is that it's quite simply one of the easiest things to measure. So, it's not necessarily easy for you and I to do a VO2 max test. In fact, there's few things in life that feel harder than doing one yourself. But in terms of the lab, it's one of the easiest things to measure. Okay. And then there is a fairly strong correlation between VO2 max and performance. So those are the two reasons why. Um, However, what's very important is that the person with the highest VO2 max isn't necessarily the person who wins the race, because efficiency comes into play. And what we actually often see is that the slightly less efficient runner actually has the higher VO2 max out of necessity, and typically doesn't win the race. The more efficient runner would typically run the race. But yes, if we could predict who was going to win purely on VO2, we wouldn't need to run the race. So luckily, it's not as simple as that. But it's easy to measure, number one, and there is a strong correlation between that and performance. And that's why it's become such a popular thing,
Mm.
particularly in research. When we're looking for changes or improvements, it's much easier to set up a VO2 max test than it is to set up a track meet or a half marathon or a marathon or a cycle race, whatever the case may be. So that's quite literally why VO2 max is so popular.
Okay, cool. We'll talk about the measuring protocols and how to do that in just a moment. But it's also of recent times become super popular in the sort of health span, longevity, that sort of, I don't want to say market, but that sort of niche, if you'd like. What is the sort of link between VO2 max and living longer and healthier lives?
Yeah, so again, that has some strong correlation. So there may not be direct causality, and that's, we have to be a little bit careful in research, but there are strong correlations, so we can make quite a few inferences. So we do know that there is a base level of VO2 max required to perform certain tasks. Okay, so a really good example of that is that if your VO2 max falls below 30 milliliters per kilogram of body mass per minute, then you are going to struggle to walk up and down stairs on your own. So part of why it's such an effective tool is because we can go, right, we know that there are numbers that we really, if we want to have a good life, there is a number that we need to maintain. There's a nice buildup of age-related norms so that you can tell if you are good, bad, indifferent compared to people in your age from a health perspective. Not necessarily, I mean, it's predictive of performance, but it's not necessarily that the highest VO2 in a 70-year-old is going to be the winner of the race. Although as we get older, that does tend to tighten up a little bit more. But yeah, effectively that is it. We know that for health, you need to be able to utilize a now, I'm going to get a little bit complicated here, Brad, because I want to explain why that's the case. So, why does that tie? Well, because part of what VO2 max is it partly a demand from the body. Okay, and that's why it's trainable. So, if you train really hard, you improve the effectiveness of your muscles, you improve the muscle density, you improve the amount of work that the muscles can do, you improve the mitochondrial density. Those things increase demand. In response to the increase in demand, the body improves the circulation. Okay. So as demand decreases, as we get older, and we talk about this often, is that as we get older, less muscle mass, less ability to do work. So part of the issue is that as we get older, the demand starts to slide. Okay? So we measure one because it's easy to measure, but the VO2 is a symptom. It's not the cause. The cause is the decrease in demand. So we need to keep the demand high. So you need to train. You need to stay active. In order to be able to live well and take the stairs and move down the stairs, we've got to train so that we can maintain the body's ability to demand oxygen and at the same time improve the body's ability to supply oxygen. So demand and supply, that keeps us with a good VO2 max for our age, which means we can continue to perform well if performance is your goal. But much more important for the question you asked, for us to stay healthy and not need a wheelchair to be wheeled into our grandchildren's weddings.
All right, cool. I think that really does lay the groundwork for this. Let's before we talk about improving and how to get better a better VO2 max, let's talk about the measurement side of things. And we often talk about measurement, especially when we talk about other metrics like heart rates and making sure that we are using sort of gold standard. When it comes to VO2 max, what is the gold standards for measuring it?
So that would be a direct measurement of the actual oxygen that you are using. So that would be in a lab with an oxygen oximeter. They would strap a mask to your face. It would have a gas analyzer. The new models are pretty good. You can put them on your back, or you actually have it as a separate machine with the pipes going in. And what it literally does is it has a known quantity of gas that's in a gas cylinder, and we then calibrate that machine to know exactly what quantity of gas is inside that gas cylinder, and then it will analyze the gas that is in the atmosphere that's going into your mouth. So that's oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, a couple of other much smaller quantities of gas. And then it samples it again as you breathe out into this mask, and it draws these samples. And then it looks at the change in concentration. And in this instance, specifically with oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay. And it looks at both of those for two reasons. Number one, yes, we want to know what the maximum or where your peak VO2 arrives at. So, which point are you now taking out maximum oxygen? But we also want to see where the oxygen carbon dioxide ratio changes, because that also tells us at what point you move from being predominantly aerobic metabolism or producing energy for the muscles in pathways that only use oxygen, and when we start getting a contribution from pathways that do not need oxygen, and those are called anaerobic pathways. So we also use these tests to then pick out that point, and specifically so that we can get threshold, because the threshold tells us much more about your efficiency, the effectiveness of your training program, the percentage of maximum that you can hold for a given period of time, depending on whether you're training for a 5K, 8K marathon, etc. But yeah, so that is how the equipment works. We typically sample, well, the sampling happens all the way through, but we typically increase the intensity of that workout. And these can be done on a bike, Brad, it can be done on a treadmill. Again, if you've got a space pack, you could probably do it on a track, but this is much more controlled on a treadmill or a bicycle in the lab. And we increase the intensity of the exercise every minute to 2 minutes, depending on what we are testing for. So are we wanting a pure VO2 max and to be satisfied that we're very close to your VO2 max? We refer to it actually as peak VO2, because we always feel like in a lab setting, we're probably not going to get to your absolute maximum, but we will get your peak value for today's test. Um, and we'll make those ramps slightly longer if we want to allow you to get to steady state at each level, if we are more interested in getting your threshold, which for training purposes is possibly a more important value. But the two protocols just diverge. One will just go up every minute until you basically going to fly off the back of the machine if you don't quit, and the other will go up slower, which means, of course, you will build up more fatigue. So you'll have a slightly lower peak on the longer protocol than on the shorter protocol.
Yeah, and Lindsey, you said from as far as tests go in sports science, this is one of the easier ones. I think we do need to stipulate it's the easier one for the sports scientist. When you're actually doing this as an athlete, these tests are super hard. So yeah, they're not a walk in the park, that is for sure. And yeah, you wanted to add something there
100%.
before.
And we like screaming at you. We're screaming at you, trying to keep you on there as long as you can possibly stay on there. So we really make you stay until there's pretty much nothing left to give. I've got people lined up behind. You're in a harness in case you do fly off the back of the thing. But yes, so it's certainly not easy for the subject.
Yeah, absolutely. But not everyone has access to a lab as well. So that's obviously the gold standard, and it is nice to have it. But I think one of the reasons there has been so much interest in VO2 max of late too is because a lot of our wearables are spitting out a VO2 max number. So that is another way to get a VO2 max reading. And then there are also online calculators. Won't you talk us through the devices and how accurate those numbers are? And then let's just touch on online calculators too, and should we be using those?
So those are all built on algorithms. And the problem, and I stressed this quite a lot early on, is to say that a high VO2 max doesn't necessarily equal the best performance. But what they've tried to do over many years, I mean, we're talking since probably the 50s, but certainly the studies that, or when I was at university, a lot of the studies that we were using were from the 60s and 70s. But effectively what they did is they were like, right, let's find a much simpler way for the subject to do it, but also how do we do this for larger groups of people? And so we have things like the bleep test, which not an easy test, yo-yo test. We've got the Cooper test, step up test. There's just so many tests, and what they did is they said, right, if we take 1,000 people and do a VO2 on them, and then we let them do these large number of tests, the people who score well on the bleep test tend to score well on the VO2. So now how can we start to stratify this? So if you can do level 3.6 on the bleep test, or if you can do level 11.2 on the bleep test, what does that mean for your VO2? So I'm telling you all of this to let you know that everything is an indirect measure, and then they try to circle it back to the gold standard. But we've all seen a bell curve. And so what you'll find is that a lot of people fit nicely within one standard deviation, but there'll always be loads of people that fall outside on the tail. And because we're working with a bell curve distribution, actually what these VO2 things do is that for a large portion, but not for the entire population, for a large portion, standard deviation plus and minus 1, it will give a reasonably accurate VO2 max. But as soon as you start to slide outside of that number 1, you will be getting lots of people that it will either over or under predict, and almost always with the watches, it under predicts actual VO2 for most people. So now let's move away from the actual indirect test you can do. Now we look at VO2 max, and it starts to take in things like heart rate, training speeds, training volumes. And the same thing that they've tried to done is what they've tried to do, my English. What they've tried to do is they have tried to then correlate that to VO2. And there's a difference between male and female, which we haven't even touched on yet. But so they've tried to correlate these things male, female, and as I said, probably plus or minus one standard deviation of the general population. They are close enough to use, but kind of as we move out of that, it becomes less and less accurate. And I've got to tell you that from a health perspective, it probably catches lots of people in that plus or minus one standard deviation. But just by virtue of the fact that you are listening to this podcast and you care about your performance, tells me you probably aren't in that plus or minus one standard deviation of the human population. And so VO2 is useful, but you shouldn't fixate on the number because it's probably not highly accurate for you as an individual. If you want to use the number for training, I would get to a lab and get measured.
All right, cool. Lindsey, and that's obviously the devices. Does the same apply to online calculators?
So online calculators very much are, look, they're based on research. So yeah, exactly the same thing. Very tight in the general population, and then it just, as you get into the more and more active population and the top 5%, top 1%, it becomes less and less accurate.
Okay, so if these numbers, I mean, you're saying obviously the lab test is the way to go, but if you have a number, let's say for instance your watch spits out a number, how do you know if that's good or bad? Like, is there a way to gauge, like, you know what, it's not as good as it should be, I need to improve it? What is a good, like, do we know what a good number is, or is it, I mean, you mentioned it's highly specific to the individual?
Yeah, so I think for the purposes of health, yes, but I don't, and I do want to stress this again. It's like, let's say you are between the age of 55 and 56, okay? Then a number over 45 is amazing, okay? You are at the upper echelon of the normative data. But from a performance point of view, I'm telling you that anybody who's even in a small race is finishing on the podium is going to be higher than that. So they are useful in terms of going, right, where am I on this health curve? And as I said earlier, if you go under 30 on these predictive, on the watches, there's a good chance that you are someone who's really battling to go up and down stairs. So yes, the normative data is there, and it is useful. Let me give you an example like this, Brad. Excellent VO2 between the age of 18 and 25 for males, okay, is 60 milliliters per kg per minute of exercise, okay? But 18 to 25 is also the range where we have Olympic champions, and an Olympic champion won't have a VO2 less than 75, probably somewhere between 78 and 83, okay? So yeah, that's why I'm giving these values, but in the active population, yeah, there's not lots of normative data or comparative data. And that's again why I talk about, look at you as the individual. So I think if your numbers are low, if you're listening to this and you're over 50 and your numbers are below 40, you probably need to do something about that, because what it means is that when you get to 65, 70, there's a good chance that your numbers are going to be below 30, and that you're then going to be needing assistance to get around. And that's what we want to try and avoid. And I think you're on mute.
Sorry, my bad. You then did mention the difference between male and female. What are the differences? Are there differences? What do we need to be cognizant of?
Yeah, so typically what happens is that males, so remember I spoke about the demand and supply. So typically the reason for the differences in males and females are that males have a much higher relative muscle mass than, not relative, they have a much higher absolute muscle mass than females of equivalent size, age, etc. And so those numbers tend to be lower, but they do get closer together, I suppose is the word to use, much later in life. So I can tell you that between the ages of, say, 45 and 55, it's very similar. We want to be around 40 is rated as excellent, good 34 to 40, and then between 56 and 65, we see a big drop off in females as they go through menopause, where they will drop to 32 to 37, being considered good, where men 55 to 65 should still stay around that 40 mark. And then as women go over the age of 65, they tend to drop to 28 to 32. And so that starts to get into that region where, we start to have trouble going up flights of stairs, and men typically drop then to 33 to 37. So still, and again, this is general population stuff that I'm looking at. And so what it tells you is that in the general population, tons of people who live over 65 do not get to live past 65 with a good quality of life.
Yeah. All right, Linz, you mentioned at the start of this podcast that it is trainable. So that is the good news. It's not like you're given a number and off you go. Unlucky you were last in line when they were handing out VO₂ numbers. Yours is terrible. You're going to suck for the rest of your life. But this is trainable. So let's talk about sort of how do we improve it. And I think maybe I should ask this. Do we need to specifically train our VO₂ max, or will training properly improve our VO₂ max? If you're over 50 and want to recover from sessions faster, run pain and injury free, and improve your endurance, then be sure to join Lindsey and I for our upcoming Faster Beyond 50 Masterclass. In it, we'll show you how we helped a 70-year-old run a 47-minute, 18-second 10K, and how you can take those exact same principles and apply them in your training. Simply scan the QR code that's on screen right now, or click on the link in the description below to save your seat in the training now. We look forward to seeing you there.
So that's part two. So if this was an A and B answer, then there would hopefully be a C or both of the above. So yes, training properly, but we do have to shift this. And Brad, you get to talk to me a lot, so you hear things that I say often. And my late professor, when I studied my postgrad, he had the saying that when you're young, you do cardiovascular exercise to stay fit and healthy. And as you get older, you do strength training so that you can do cardiovascular exercise so that you can stay fit and strong. And so, yes, training correctly will impact VO₂ max positively. And we have to impact it positively on both sides of the curve. Firstly, we have to do it on the demand side. And so to improve the demand side, we have to train. Okay, so the training, doing the strength training, getting out there and doing the lung busting anaerobic workouts. And now that sounds so counterintuitive. Why do we want to do anaerobic workouts to stimulate the aerobic system and improve oxygen? Well, because when you do anaerobic workouts, you are actually performing at your maximum. Okay. So you are creating a shortage, which then causes a reaction from the body. So we want those two things, because those are the things that push up the demand. Okay. Then on the other side of the curve, we want to improve the supply. And the supply then means that we have to do the training in the correct ratios. Okay. And this is where we get back to the old Coach Parry hobby horse. And that means we have to do lots of easy runs, easy enough so that we can build up all the pathways that we need to support those strength and hard anaerobic sessions that we are doing. Okay. Because when we do those easy, the demand forces the body to respond, and the best response comes when we're doing the right training at the right time. And that's when we improve the heart's ability to circulate blood around the body. That's when we improve the red blood cells, or increasing the density of the red blood cells. That's when we improve the number of mitochondria that are sitting in the muscles, so that we can process more oxygen at the site of the muscles. It's when we improve the capillary density in the muscle so that we can get more blood into the actual muscle so we can extract more oxygen. So the supply part of that equation comes from doing the easy runs, doing enough of them, to create a platform to allow you to really push yourself on your hard days. And then those two things come together to push up our VO2 max. And certainly once we get into our 60s and 70s, to help us defend our VO2 max and keep it high and only let it slowly trickle down.
Linz, it's super interesting because I just as you were explaining that, I was thinking about sort of because I genuinely I'm not a massive data fan when it comes to running. Like I just love running just because it gets me out of the house and I get into my own head and that sort of thing. So I'm not one of those real sort of like people who dig deep into the data, but I love looking at the data, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything to me in the greater scheme of things. I've mentioned it lots on this podcast that I love tracking my sleep score because it's like this little scoreboard that I can try and improve all the time, and that obviously has a tangible benefit to the way I'm feeling the next day and the day after that and the day after that. But one thing I've noticed, I haven't really dug too deep into the VO2 max numbers, but one thing that you said there really sort of just sparked something in my head. But one thing that I've noticed is that when I do a high intensity session, generally my watch predicts a higher VO2 max. So you were talking about the sort of, you need to do the lung busting. And I think the danger here is because it's almost like if you do a high intensity session and you look at your VO2 max number afterwards, it's slightly improved. The danger here is to go, well, those are the only runs that actually improve my VO2 max. So that's all I'm going to do. But as we've seen with the general sort of training and what we talk about in the over 50s with our Fast to Beyond 50 training frameworks, is you need that base, and the aerobic zone 2 sort of stuff is that base that, yes, you might get an immediate spike in the VO2 max if you're just doing the high intensity stuff, but long term that's not sustainable because it's setting you up for injury, more fatigue, less recovery, that sort of thing. Am I correct in saying that?
Correct in saying that. And look, we always, again, when we're talking health and performance, we've got to talk about two different things here. So let's say, for example, you were only interested in this for health and you really couldn't care about your performance in any way, shape, or form. You could do more high intensity workouts spread out further apart. So you could do that, and you would get good results, particularly from the mitochondrial density point of view and the demand side of the curve. You would never get as high as you potentially want to unless you were doing some form of basal aerobic work. But from a health point of view, you'd probably defend a fairly good VO2. And look, this is where VO2 is slightly misleading, and that's what I was trying to allude to right at the beginning of this podcast, is that if VO2 is the only thing that impacts performance, you could train hard as often as you could without injuring yourself, and your VO2 max goes up. So we've seen studies where comparison between people who only did easy training, those that did combination training, and those that did only high intensity training. And in short term, okay, and this is very important, in short term studies, the high intensity group always wins because their demand is sky high. Okay. Long term studies, the easy only group and the mixed group both outstrip, even just in VO2 max. But in these short-term studies, it shows you can push your VO2 max up faster by killing yourself more regularly than you can by following proper training principles. But there are almost zero examples of where that won somebody a race. Okay. So that's where science and what happens in a lab doesn't always come together in the outside world. Okay, so to answer your question, from a pure health point of view, from a pure providing you with enough of a platform to live well and do activities of daily living well, you could thump yourself maybe 3 times a week, spread them out. And that may, because I haven't tried this kind of thing, give you enough recovery in between to not hurt yourself, not break down with illness or injury. But what we know for 100% sure is that by doing a large body of work, 80 to 90% of your training at lower intensities, and then to do 10 to 20% of your training volume at high intensities where you knock it out the park. That's your best pathway for sustainable progress. And I would bet that in the long term, it's probably also your most sustainable way of staying healthy and maintaining a good VO2 max.
Yeah, Lindsey, because I wanted to like just touch on the flip side of that coin of just doing the high intensity stuff, because we often talk about zone 2 and it's all over the internet. I saw there was a YouTuber that put a video out talking about why like everyone's talking about zone 2 and zone 2 is not good, but we've spoken about it oscillates. You get people who just like will knock zone 2 and people who just swear by zone 2, but we are also not saying you only need to do zone 2. But in a case like this, what would happen to your VO2 max if you only did easy runs?
So your in theory, your supply chain would improve a lot. And so in theory, your VO2 should also therefore improve. But the demand side of that curve is so important, Brad. So if you ran easy enough but long enough, okay, that would probably push you into a point where your muscles would fatigue enough that the individual muscles would maintain a high demand, but there would be a lot of rotation of those muscles. Now I'm going deep into the forest here. But so that could possibly still lead to some stimulus in VO2 max. I would argue, though, that you would still lose the neuromuscular component. And so, yes, for activities of daily living, that combined with the strength training, I think would be perfectly good for and let's use a moderate walk. If you did a moderate walk, 30 to 45 minutes, most days of the week, and lots of strength training, you would provide enough stimulus that I reckon you would maintain a pretty good VO2 max or lose extremely slowly. But what you'll lose is that ability if you get chased by a dog, if you see your grandkid walking towards a body of water, you would lose that ability to jump up and go and do something about it. And so that's why for me, as we get older, I mean, you were saying we don't only advocate easy runs. I mean, to the contrary, I think as you get older, it's even more important that we do. I mean, when I was 20, 29, even when I was 39, I could run between 90 and 120 Ks a week, just jogging around the place, and then line up and go and run a 36-minute 10K and a sub 3 hour marathon. I didn't actually need the high intensity intervals. I would run better if I did them, but I didn't need them. Now, if I try and run, well, I'm going to try and run sub 3 hour marathon. If I without the interval work, it's not gonna happen. I lose range of motion. I lose the coordination of being able to run fast. So as we get older, it becomes more, the demand side of the equation becomes more important as we get older than when we are younger.
Yeah, Lindsey, and that's you talk about the supply and the demand, and that's why it's important to do both the base, the sort of zone 2 base training and the higher intensity. And you just touched on there the other benefits of doing that higher intensity as well is the range of motion, the sort of flexibility and that sort of stuff. So it is important, and it becomes more important as we get older as well. Let's talk practical terms now, and obviously this is what we do here at Coach Parry, and the athletes who listen to this podcast who train with us will know that these our training sort of frameworks are built and structured the same way. But if somebody's listening to this and they're not using one of our training frameworks or using our training app, and I'm going to give it a punt as well. If you'd like to check it out, the link is in the description below. Practical terms, how does this look from a training perspective to sustainably improve and sort of maintain that line in your VO2 max over time?
So it's 2 to 3 strength training sessions in a week. So that's super important. And I think if you're on the health side of the spectrum and not the performance side of the spectrum, I would go three strength trainings per week. If you're on the performance side of the spectrum, you would manipulate your year so that in peak training times, you're doing 2, and in between the peak training times, you're doing 3 strength trainings a week. And then you're looking at 4 to maximum 5 cardiovascular sessions in a week. And again, on the health spectrum, those can be swimming, running, cycling, whatever your preferred, brisk walking. On the performance side of the spectrum, it'll be your chosen sport. In our case, that would be running. It could be cycling, whatever it is, and you would do 4 of the sport you're training for, and then supplement or complement that with a cycling session, swimming session, running session, depending on what your sport is. And now in those cardiovascular sessions, those 4 to 5 cardiovascular sessions that you are doing in a week, you would be doing, if it's a 4-day a week, you'd be doing 3 of those days at low intensity, and 1 of those days you'd really be pushing yourself. And that's kind of very simply how you would put that together.
I love that. Lindsey, and then realistically, I mean, if somebody wanted to set a goal to improve their VO2 max, what would be like a realistic expectation for getting your VO2 max number better in like a 3 to 6 month time span?
So if it's me and you that are relatively active, and we could train better, but we actually don't do too badly, you're probably looking at, like, in real terms, like 2 to 5 milliliters per kg per minute. On a watch, you're probably looking at maximum 10, but let's say 2 to 8 on the watch. But if you are sitting there listening, and this is for health, and that 30 number that I've thrown out has you worried that you might not be in that ballpark, yeah, you can give it a big nudge in the short term. So yeah, 10 plus. And even if you're sitting there and you are 65 to 70 and on the wrong side of that curve, probably not as much as that, but what you will absolutely do is you will keep it the same for 10, 15 years. And so right now, you might still not be considered at the top end of your age group. But if you do this and do it well for the next 10 years, you will slowly climb through the ranks as your contemporaries tank, and you just stay the same.
Awesome. I love this chat, Lindsey. Is there anything you think that we've left out that maybe we should include? But I think we've covered this pretty in depth.
We have, Brad. And what I want to just say to finish off in terms of this whole longevity talk and everything that people say is, what I would encourage you to do, if you're sitting on this call now, whether you are 45 years old or whether you are 75 years old, sit down and think about what the things are that you would like to be able to do at 85. Okay. And then go and investigate what numbers you need to be able to do, both from a strength point of view. So being able to balance on one leg, what sort of leg press you need to do, VO2 max that you need to do. Have a look at what you need, then have a look at what you are now, and then figure out what you need to do to make sure that you can have those numbers at 80 and you can still do the things that you want to do when you're 80.
Yeah, I love that, Lindsey. And just 2 things on there before we wrap this up. The first one is, I didn't actually tell you this, but you and I did a training webinar a few weeks ago where we often talk about being in your 50s, 60s, and 70s as running. And I got an email from a gentleman who was on that live training with us, really putting me in my place. And I want to thank him for it, because he was like, why do we only talk about 60s, the 50s, 60s, and 70-year-olds? He said there's lots of 80-year-olds that listen to our stuff and do what we say. So to all the 80-year-olds that are listening, I apologize. We definitely are talking to you as well. And I know there's some 90s too. So yeah, keep doing what you're doing, because you're obviously on the right track. And then the second thing, Lindsey, you and I actually haven't even spoken about this. We're working on something behind the scenes here at Coach Parry, because you and I are both passionate about the longevity and the health span side of things around running, and just keeping us not just running until we're that age, but keeping us alive and healthy until that age. And we are working on something around this sort of more sort of health and longevity than performance. So I'm going to pop a link into the description that if you want to find out more about it, we're just going to put a basic early waiting list together. We're only going to take a handful of sort of coaching clients to do this with. And if it is something that you are interested in, not just from a performance perspective, but really optimizing your health and longevity and health span, we'd love to sort of touch base and find out exactly what it is you're thinking. And possibly there could be a match there as well. So click on that link in the description as well. We'd love to put you on that waiting list, and we'll let you know what we're up to once we get there as well. So, Lindsey, as always, great to catch up. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. We look forward to catching up again next week. Cheers.
Cheers, everyone.